Hi, Rosemary. Thank you again for agreeing to join us today. It's a pleasure to have you today on our podcast.
Thanks, Aniket. I'm very pleased to be with you, and honored too. Thank you.
Perfect. For our listeners, can you briefly describe your position at Vodafone and what that involves in terms of ESG?
Yes, I'm Vodafone's Group General Counsel and Company Secretary. That means I'm responsible for Vodafone's legal affairs everywhere that it trades, and I'm also responsible for ensuring that our board operates smoothly, working with the chairman and the directors and the executive directors. So I'm very fortunate. I have a role that enables me to look across the whole of Vodafone and the work that it's doing. In relation to ESG specifically, our ESG program is sponsored by another executive committee member, our Director of External Affairs. But all of us, as members of our leadership team, we each have a role to play in promoting ESG across Vodafone.
Excellent. Thank you for that description. So we can dive right into the questions. I'd like to start with some recent events that have been going on. CPI in the US has reached almost 9% earlier last month at the time of this recording, and in the UK, likewise, at 9% is what's been estimated. And the S&P in the US has also entered a bear market. I can imagine that organizations are shifting their priorities around to compensate or address these issues. But how can leadership ensure that ESG doesn't fall through the cracks as this is happening?
I think the inflation rates are genuinely remarkable. And the first time the generation that's in the workforce now, the first time many of them have lived through inflation at this rate. We have operations in Turkey, which has inflation in the region of 70%. It's hyperinflation, and that makes 9% look almost manageable, but 9% is a big thing too. So you're absolutely right. The pressure of inflation, the general geopolitical uncertainties that everybody around the world is facing at the moment, and indeed the impact that we're seeing of climate change, all of them are having a very real effect on what companies are doing and focusing on at the moment. But I think in some ways, these short-term shocks, in a way, these short-term issues that have to be dealt with, they almost reinforce the need to not lose sight of the long term as well, because I do believe that short-term issues they're like sort of small waves on top of big swell that are rolling through, and I think they are symptoms of some of the things that companies and governments need to and are trying to address in the broader ESG world, particularly, but the environmental and the social. The governance side of ESG is a complex area that's always there, and is perhaps the one that's least affected in some ways by these big shifts that are happening to our society and are having impacts on businesses in the short term. But as I say, certainly at Vodafone, where I work, we are very actively trying to balance that, the long-term perspective that an ESG perspective gives you, whilst in that long-term view, you need to have short-term actions that you are effecting, otherwise change doesn't happen. But balancing that on the one side and the need to keep that long-term train moving against short-term needs. And it's a very active conversation that we're having at the moment. So if you're looking to balance the effects of inflation, that means you're going to be looking at how you can reduce your spend, reduce your outgoings, and inevitably initiatives that are there for ESG will be part of the mix. The trick, if that's the right word, is not to allow those ESG activities that need budget to make them happen, need resources to make them happen. You need to make sure they don't get chopped. And And again, in Vodafone, the way that we deal with that, the way we deal with all of the dilemmas that we're dealing with as a business, is very much to look at our purpose. We have 3 purpose pillars that largely map onto most of the elements of ESG. We use those purpose pillars very much as guides to us to help us make those choices, because it's all about making choices. But certainly the challenges of inflation, of geopolitical risk, they make those choice dilemmas hard, and that's why it's very helpful to have something that you can use, whether it's a set of values and a purpose statement or a purpose vision. Having those northern lights, in a way, those guiding principles, can help make those challenging decisions a little bit easier to make.
Excellent. So I think that's definitely noticeable in terms of Vodafone's ESG performance. It certainly has been a leader in the past. So a lot of listeners listening may have questions about barriers to ESG in terms of a cultural shift required at the board level or the leadership level. Do you have any advice for listeners in terms of that?
I think I would say that at Vodafone, the growth and interest in the company in ESG, well, it's been a long time growing. When I joined Vodafone over 10 years ago, and it was already then monitoring its environmental impact. It had targets around certainly the E and the S, and it was and still is well governed and takes governance very seriously. So it was already on that path, and a lot of that was baked into the culture of the company, even sort of 10 or so years ago, as is the case with a lot of long established companies that I can think of. And I think the two are connected. So strong ESG credentials, I think, do turn into long-term sustainability of an organisation, or can do. Excuse me. I would say our employees and our customers both helped to propel ESG further up, or to make it more visible inside Vodafone. Particularly employees, I think. Employees now increasingly and more of them are seeking to work for companies that have strong ESG credentials. They want to work in an organisation that matters, that has the right value set, that they can that recognises, reflects their own value set. They want to work for companies that are trying to help societies improve, and that strong driver, it resonates with people. And certainly, I mean, if I say it's part of the Vodafone employer proposition, that sounds as if we're doing it in a rather manipulative way. It's not that at all. It is that we are recruiting people for whom these things are important, and we create a community of like-minded people, and that goes all the way up to senior leadership and the board. So it's surprisingly easy. Maybe it's not surprising, but it's happily easy to tap into people's innate wish to do the right thing, I think, and their wish to be positive contributors to society. And I don't think that's to do with where they are in an organisation. I think that's quite a strong driver. The bigger challenge is around resource allocation. So when you, and that goes back to my previous comments about making choices in financially challenging times. But in terms of driving a culture, certainly within Vodafone, it has been both top down and bottom up. More bottom up, if talking about bottoms is the right thing in the context of employee base, because they are the drivers of the value and values in the company. But it's it comes from across the company. I don't think having regard and a wish to be strong in ESG, I don't think that's peculiar to one particular section or segment or level in a company. At Vodafone, we do have a very conscious program, which we call our spirit behaviors, about how we want to work together, how we think we can be most effective together. And those spirit behaviors do map onto our purpose very closely. And as I said earlier, our purpose itself aligns very closely with the ESG drivers that investors are familiar with. So it's a very, in some ways, virtuous circle. Our investors are asking for it. Our employees are certainly asking for us to be ESG responsible. And increasingly, our customers are interested in these things as well. Perhaps customers slightly less than other stakeholders. But again, we're hearing more from our customers that they are interested in particularly environmental issues, and also connectivity and whether we are playing our part in helping everyone to be connected. So it's very much everybody is involved, and I think the senior leadership is concerned to keep that virtuous circle going, and we do that through a lot of communication, a lot of storytelling, and a lot of celebration of where individuals in our organisation have gone the extra mile or have done something that resonates particularly with our purpose and the ESG drivers that we're tracking.
Excellent. It is really, quite impressive to see the progress in terms of ESG and how much customer demand has actually increased looking back at the past few years. It's really interesting. So we always like to ask our podcast guests, where do you see ESG going in the next few years?
I think that's a really interesting question. I very much hope, I really hope that the momentum that there is behind ESG, which you mentioned, continues. I think it will. I think the balance between E and S and G is interesting. I think the E, the environmental part, has been perhaps the fastest moving area of development in the last few years. I think the S is really important, social impact of the work that companies do. I think again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, as inflation bites, as societies seem to be increasingly fractured, unfortunately, I think the S becomes more and more important. And governance, I see that very much as a sort of continuous theme. I'm a lawyer by background. I worry about the erosion of the rule of law in a lot of societies. I think that's a hugely dangerous change in my own country, the UK, as much as anywhere else. And I think companies do have a role to play in encouraging governments, encouraging society to recognise the value of that kind of governance as well. I do think ESG is and needs to continue to be not just something that appears to relate to companies. I think it relates to society itself and governments and how those societies are governed just as much. So I think ESG, I hope it will continue. I think it will. I think the balance between the ES and the G might shift a little bit. But certainly as far as the environment is concerned, we have no time to lose. So that we absolutely need to keep. And I hope that investors and others will keep pressure on companies to not take their foot off the accelerator on that side as well.
I think I agree with you on that point. And certainly with the environment, I agree. So Rosemary, I would like to thank you again for agreeing to join us on the podcast today. I think it has been immensely helpful for our listeners to learn more about what Vodafone has done, as well as your insights into ESG. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.